We live at a time, I think, when the barrier of deference that has always sat in front of politics and power is being pulled down as never before. A lot of that is to do with technology, the way we communicate, how we now think of ourselves and our place in the world. As we're now finding out tonight, this week, some of what has long lain behind that barrier is horrific. It speaks of power at its most arrogant and immoral and nasty and macho, let's be honest. That's part of a bigger context, it seems to me, which is that everything political a lot of the time seems to be in a state of ferment and breakdown. Some days it feels like we will have to tear down the structures of power and reinvent them if we're to take so-called progressive politics anywhere at all. I think in its own way, Brexit was symptomatic of that sense of chaos and breakdown and the end of deference, finally. The book that has drawn us here tonight is a great book, and it's great on that question in particular. There's a quote right at the start of chapter 1 of The Lure of Greatness by Anthony Barnett. The title of that chapter is Jailbreak, and Anthony writes, "Everyone can sense that the Brexit vote and the election of Trump are about more than a mere referendum and an election result. I'm not talking about the facts as far-reaching as they are. Something irreversible has happened, which people feel in their bones. It is the end of an era, a truly historic moment." Anthony goes on to quote the musician and author Brian Eno, formerly of Roxy Music, lately the producer of Coldplay. One of those is a great contribution to human civilization. I will leave you to decide which. Brian Eno said, "My feeling about Brexit was not anger at anybody else. It was anger at myself for not realizing what was going on. I had thought that all those UKIP people and those National Fronty people were in a little bubble. Then I thought, fuck, it was us. We were in the bubble, we didn't notice it. There was a revolution brewing and we didn't spot it because we didn't make it. We expected we were going to be the revolution." Now, I may make myself unpopular by saying this, but clearly our side, the progressive, liberal, left, pro-European side, lost. And while a lot of us, I'll include myself in this, have a sense that Brexit is going to be a disaster with terrible economic and political consequences, I'm not sure whether collectively people on the left, the liberal, progressive, pro-European side of politics, have thought enough about why we lost. And doing that clearly is a precondition of starting the debate about Europe again, perhaps in very different terms from the terms in which we've had it in the past. With a view, perhaps, you never know, to avoiding Brexit, or certainly avoiding the hardest, most damaging version of it. So we're going to talk about where we are, the change that we're going through, how we make the case for England, for Britain in Europe, and how we break out, perhaps, of the bubble that stopped us seeing, some of us anyway, what was going on. That's what we're here to discuss. With me to discuss this, first of all, is Anthony Barnett, the co-founder of Charter 88 and Open Democracy, and the author of The Lure of Greatness, a brilliant, brilliant book. I called it a punk polemic in the New Statesman. I now see it's in hardback, so it's not a punk polemic anymore, but it's available at the back there, and I'm sure you'll be signing copies as well. Next to him is Caroline Lucas, the co-leader of the Green Party. Over there is Clive Lewis, Labour MP, a mercifully strong anti-Brexit voice. And next to him is my Guardian colleague, Suzanne Moore, one of those rare political voices that defies, transcends stereotype, and speaks the unvarnished truth. Please join me in welcoming them. So everyone's going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then quite briskly we'll open this up to the floor and then return to the panel and see what happens after that. And I will turn first, because this is kind of your event, to Anthony.
Thank you very much indeed. This meeting came about thanks to the offer that we made to those who supported the publication of The Lure of Greatness. And I want to really thank all of you who made possible a book that every other publisher in London turned down, to the baffled fury of my agent. And it was made possible thanks to John Mitchison, my editor, and his wonderful Unbound team who put on this event with their new model of publishing. We decided not to have a parliamentary-style debate of for and against, but to share the views of where we go from here amongst those of us who want to stay on in the European Union. And very helpfully, Adam Ramsey, who's also helping at the organizing the event, my Open Democracy editor, said to me, tell people what you want them to take away from the meeting. Well, I want you to take away three things. First, don't be a Ramona, be a fighter. Don't hope it's a nightmare from which the country will awake. Roll up your sleeves. We can stop Brexit, but the country that was there before we can't return to. It's going to be the fight of our lives. Second, think about the forces that got us into this, that will need to be confronted if we're going to get out of it. Brexit was a historic event rooted in causes. Come to your own view about what these are. And third, think like Europeans. In my case, an English European. This is not a call to deny our nationality, but to give them a European twist. If you think like a Brit, then Europe's always the other, and the relationship is reduced to economic gain. And we saw this happen in the referendum. Of course, material benefits and fairness matter hugely, but not exclusively. And together, these three things bring me to the need to offer, it's a question. The question is, what do we offer as an alternative to Brexit? And any alternative demands having a better answer to the cry of Brexit, which is take back control. And there are two aspects to any of our answer of taking back control, or at least two. One of them is socioeconomic, and the other is national political. The socioeconomic side must answer the rage against a system that made people powerless in the name of democracy and reduced them to insecurity for the benefit of an elite, even to the point of putting our NHS in danger. But it must also come up with a solution to the end of Great Britain, an entity which we now refer to in code as Global Britain. The first set of issues, I think, the socioeconomic ones, people are getting their head around and beginning to understand. The second is harder. We're all inside and part of British politics, and to seek a solution within it demands using the means that it provides us with, and these means have led us to Brexit. So to break out of this trap, we need imagination. And this, I hope, is one of the things I attempt to do to provide in my book. So one way of seeing Britain, to see it differently, is this. Britain is an old, multinational system organized around a winner-takes-all political culture that fetishizes absolute sovereignty and doesn't codify its rules, hence its ability to pull a referendum out the hat. The EU is a new, larger, also multinational, constitutionalizing itself around a concept of sharing sovereignty. The UK inside the EU is bound to feel threatened. And the solution for the UK is the Europeanization of our democracy, with, for example, fair voting. This started in Scotland and in London with its mayor, but it never reached the centre, and these partial reforms left England fuming. With nothing better on offer, those who fumed clung to the old British system. They became the threatened patriots of what I call its empire state. After the financial crash, they offered their archaic indignation to the solution of the contemporary fury at their economic powerlessness and insecurity that people felt. And this created this extraordinary cross toxic majority for Brexit in England. And to challenge this, we need not just economic and social policies, but an ambitious democratic politics, ambitious enough to make a claim, our claim on the future of Europe, because our fellow Europeans want the English impulse for liberty and freedom. And if we want a politics that offers our country democratic control, then it needs to be confident enough to want to have a say over the fate of our continent, because that's our fate too. And that's what I mean when I say that we need to think like Europeans. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Caroline.
Okay, thank you, John. The subject for tonight's debate, can we return to Europe? And my answer to that is yes, I believe we can if a number of conditions are fulfilled. Because essentially the withdrawal of the letter triggering Article 50 is primarily a political issue, not a legal one or a technical one. And it's those political conditions that I want to highlight tonight. So in particular, obviously one condition would have to be that there is sufficient public support for a referendum on the final deal, and if people then vote to reject the deal and to remain inside the EU. Second condition, if the risks of Brexit continue to mount to such a degree that they outweigh the very real risks of how revisiting a referendum result in which a majority did vote to leave will feel to those who voted to leave, and how it will be played indeed by the leaders of that Leave campaign. I think the situation we find ourselves in now is one where there are no risk-free options. There are just least bad options. And finally, crucially, I think there's a key condition around our willingness to demonstrate sufficient good faith, both to the people of this country and to our EU colleagues, that we're not simply trying to return to the status quo ante. We're not just simply turning the clock back to the 22nd of June 2016 and pretending that all of the factors that gave rise to the referendum were somehow not real. They were some kind of, moment of madness from which we've now recovered. That will not work. So a return to Europe, I think, is possible, but how likely is it? In other words, how would we best create the conditions to be able to address those three conditions that I have set out? So first, on winning a referendum on the deal, I think we need to be very clear, first of all, that we are not, underline, talking about a second referendum. Never let the words second referendum pass your lips, because when you do, people assume you are simply talking about rerunning the same question that people were asked on the 23rd of June. And that is not what we are saying. We are saying the Prime Minister has said that MPs should have the final say on the deal, on the fine print of the deal with whatever she comes back with from Brussels, and indeed, hopefully, if there is no deal, that we would also get a say on that. So the Prime Minister has gone as far as to say it's MPs who should have that final say. I think what we need to say is that that's not good enough, that that's part of it, but the other part has to be that it goes back to the British public. It was the British public that set off this whole process. It should be the British public that have the final say on it. And I would argue that that's not denying democracy, it's enhancing it. I would make the case that that referendum on the 23rd of June was not some kind of freeze frame that is set in stone forever. It was a moment in a process, and processes evolve, and as more information becomes available, people must be able and have the right to revisit that issue when they are in the possession of greater information. But I want to make the case that it is going to be crucial about who the messengers are in that process. People were and are angry and frustrated for many reasons, many of them set out in Anthony's book. And those causes can also at least partly be summed up in the words of Russell Brand when he said, people saw a bright red button that said, fuck off establishment, and they pressed it. So it is almost uniquely unhelpful for the voices in favour of a return to Europe to be quintessentially voices of that same establishment. And in the referendum, I saw firsthand how New Labour politicians and staffers, combined with Cameron's Conservatives, basically they came together to triangulate the Stronger In campaign into failure. And I remember saying so many times that we need to talk more about people's values, their identity, but instead the old-style rulebook and messaging Bible was used. People were asked to choose between taking their country back or their weekly shopping cost going up a little. So the message was bad, but the messengers were even worse. And so that's why I think we need to work on and build on the work of campaigns like Another Europe is Possible, particularly to demonstrate to young people that there is a genuinely radical case here that we are making. So then on this issue of whether the risks of Brexit are likely to outweigh the very real risks of how revisiting a previous referendum result will play out, well, I would argue that the evidence is mounting daily to suggest that that those risks of Brexit are greater. And we'll have plenty of time to discuss that. We're all very familiar with the economic risks, for example, the fall in the pound, the rise in inflation, so on and so forth. But you know what? It's not just the economic risks we're taking. I think what's becoming clearer is that we are heading down a path of isolation that doesn't just narrow the economic options when it comes to the markets that we trade with, but it narrows our horizons as people as well. It marks our physical isolation from the continent of Europe with a mental isolation as well. And just briefly, I would flag in particular the impact of that on young people, because when the Prime Minister goes on about the will of the people, I think it is quite incumbent upon us to say which people. And if you're talking about young people, I would make the case that this Brexit result has betrayed their opportunities in a huge way. And we know that young people disproportionately voted to remain. They are the ones who are going to be living longest with the impact of this Brexit decision, and yet the decision was essentially overridden by those from an older generation. And I think there's no wonder that Brexit has been called an unforgivable act of generational theft. So, are you about to stop me?
I'll give you a minute more.
A minute more, marvellous. Okay, so, the impact of Brexit on the peace process in Northern Ireland, no one talked about that in the referendum. The impact on our public services, the number of applications from EU nurses to work in our NHS has gone down 96% before we've even left the EU. You know, there are very real consequences of Brexit that were never set out in the referendum. But my last point, the point about good faith, very briefly. What does demonstrating good faith look like? Well, I think it means both reform in the UK and reform in the EU. When it comes to reform in the UK, part of that has got to be about people having a say in the decisions that affect their lives all the time, not just when they're granted a referendum. That, for me, must mean, as part of a package, electoral reform. And in parenthesis, I have to say that I don't quite see how you can genuinely be for the many, not the few, if you're not giving the many a meaningful vote through electoral reform. That's just in parenthesis. Taking back control has got to mean taking back control of our political system. I think it's got to mean the kinds of things that Anthony talks about in his book, about more power to the English regions, more of a sense of English identity. We can explore that in our discussion. But it's got to mean reform on the EU side as well, because none of us who were on the Remain side were saying the EU was perfect, far from it. There's been some excellent work being done by DM25, the organisation set up by Yanis Varoufakis, looking at what kind of reforms the EU needs to make. Some of that's about transparency, about live streaming council meetings, for example. Some of it's about shifting more power to the Parliament away from the Commission. But we've also got to look at what a multi-speed Europe would really look like, because clearly the UK is never going to sign up for ever closer union, but I don't think we need to. And I think there are some interesting straws in the wind that suggest that there is a growing recognition in the EU that that multi-speed EU is both possible and desirable. I think if the will and the ingenuity are there, the UK could find, if it chose, a place within a new EU. Our job, I think, is precisely to do what we can to generate that political will, to inspire that ingenuity, and I hope that that's what we can do by our discussions here tonight.
Clive, it's nice to have a Labour Party person here. Some of us yearn for a clear Labour voice on Brexit.
Let's see if I
No pressure. Off you go.
So, what do I think? Okay, I think in the long run, I think the UK will end up back in the EU. And I think there are three key drivers to this. The first is demographics. The age split on the referendum was clear. And I think if the same vote was held in 10 years' time, it would almost certainly come out in favour of Remain. I think most people know that, understand that instinctively. Secondly, politics. If you think about it, what hasn't gained traction outside of a small rump of elderly provincial voters who've always espoused it is this kind of is the attitude that many in the Conservative Party and that demographic feel about why the reasons why Brexit happened, and in terms of that kind of macho hard Brexit nostalgia kind of driven Brexit. It just hasn't materialised. I mean, there are a number of voices out there, but in reality, it just simply hasn't materialised. So I think politically, there is no hunger from the vast majority of people, and we've touched on why. I mean, Russell Brand, I think, summed it up most eloquently. It's a mixed picture, but that hard macho component politically just hasn't materialised. And that's something I think a lot of people thought may well happen. Could be a danger for the Labour Party. There could be this kind of patriotic backlash which the Brexit vote could have generated, and the hard right of this country would have jumped upon. But it hasn't materialised yet, and there are a number of reasons for that, which we may go into later on. And finally, it's economics. This is the bloc we are closest to, who we do our most trade with, and in the end, being outside the single market is going to be a chronic drag on our wealth-creating capability. It's a simple fact. So I think demographics, politics, and economics mean, without being complacent, there's a lot of work to do between now and that point, but I think it means that inevitably the direction of travel will be moving back towards Europe. Now, there are a couple of danger points there. I think there are two key provisos, I think, that any future Labour government will have to ensure are in place to make sure that we don't end up gravitating towards the US, which is where I fear many of the Atlanticists on the right of the Conservative Party want to see us, not just economically, but socially and politically as well. They look to the US, they look to their economy, they look to the way that they treat their citizens, their healthcare system, their prison system, and they want something similar in this country. Liam Fox and others are some of them. And there are two ways I think we can stop that. One is by ensuring that we have PR. The next Labour government has to ensure that we have PR in this country. I think it's a safety check to ensure that this country cannot be dominated by one political party, or the Conservatives in particular, the establishment, in the way that it has for much of the 20th century and a small part of the 21st so far. And secondly, a constitution, which you touched on, a written constitution. I think we need to kind of pin in, because the more that we move away from Europe, and we haven't gone yet, but let's just assume for a second that we do. I'm not sure what the relationship is, but our economic and cultural relationship with Europe will have been weakened. And those who want to gravitate us towards America, will feel emboldened to do that. And some of those safety mechanisms may well have been undermined and weakened. So I think those are some of the dangers, but I think inevitably we could and should end up back in the EU, and we can discuss about how we do that. So the two key questions that we perhaps can discuss tonight are, how long will that take, and what should we be getting on with in the meantime? So point two I wanted to raise was, please don't think a simple rerun of the referendum is going to provide an answer to that issue. It's been touched on by Caroline already. I've written an article on this for The Guardian. I never called it a second referendum. I called it a ratification vote. And people say, you mean a second referendum? I say, no, I mean a ratification vote. It's a frame. They want to be able to write off a ratification vote for whatever happens by saying you're trying to go back on democracy. You're trying to ask the same question and get a different answer. And there's form on that. We know that the EU Danish Maastricht referendum was one where they asked the same question twice, and the same one in Nice as well, I believe, in France, where that happened as well. In Ireland. on the Treaty of Nice. So there is form here, and we need to be quite clear that we are winning the argument, not just tricking the result, because I think there is a real clear danger there. They did win the referendum. We can say what we want about it in terms of how unfair it was, but they won. And to undermine that, I think, is very dangerous. It's dangerous for democracy, and I don't think it actually solves any of the underlying problems. I think the other reason we don't simply want to go for a second rerun is there's no guarantee that we'd win it within the next 5 or so years. There are no guarantees. I know the polls show that an increasing number of people feel that they made the wrong decision, but there is no guarantee we would win it. And I think if we do get a second bite of the cherry in a ratification vote, then I think we need to make sure we're going to nail it, because there will be no third chance on this issue. And finally, one of the things that's kind of come up into my mind now, and when Caroline touched on it, that we need a ratification vote, and I've written about that. One of the questions I now have come up with is, well, at the end of the Article 50 process, what will we actually be voting on? Because the Article 50 process, at the end of the Article 50 process in March 2019, there's a good chance that there will be no substantial trade deal. So what are we actually ratifying? The fact that we're coming out with no trade deal. That might be it. But there's a good chance there won't be a trade deal. So I'm now questioning what it is we'll actually be asking for in terms of that ratification vote. It does become a little bit more complicated if there is no trade deal on offer. Are we then going to wait until there is a trade deal? That could be, potentially until 2030. I don't think so, but I think it's something to think about, and I haven't got my head quite around that. The final point is something I think we need to get our heads around, and Anthony's pointed out that although the UK vote was tight, the English vote, minus London, was anything but. It was around about 45 to 55% of those who voted out. That's a substantial majority, and some might think it's not enough for a change of this magnitude, but we're not talking about a narrow win here. They won quite substantial. It was a win. They won. There's no two ways about it. So this vote, I think, has been utterly hijacked since by the English right, who've told everyone that they're tame mouthpiece in the press, and it means that we need to lurch to the right, less immigration, lower taxes, less regulation, lower environmental standards, etc., the usual. But the general election of June this year doesn't really support that view. Theresa May set out a hard neoliberal Brexit, the crush the saboteurs, kind of Thatcherite enemies within Brexit, and she utterly failed to win the national debate. So the Tories thought they were getting as did some members of the PLP, thought we were getting a rerun of 1983, and it turns out we're somewhere completely different. Where am I at? And it turns out we're somewhere different. So between May 2015 and June 2017, just 2 years, the electorate was offered the most radical change of direction they've been offered since 1979. And the English vote went up by 40%, from 8 million to 11.5 million. That is astonishing. The Scottish vote pretty much stayed the same. And that means that in 2015, when Ed Miliband made a little shuffle to the left, we put on 1 million voters. When Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party, made a quite substantial shuffle to the left, I would say, we put on 2.5 million voters. That's a massive, massive change. And what it says to me is that the general election result has told us that there is an alternative. People did vote in Brexit for something, and I think, as has been pointed out before, they were voting for, they did not want the status quo. And in many ways, Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party's change of position has come a little bit late in the day. But nonetheless, I don't think that we would have had the outcome of 2017 unless we'd had the Brexit vote. Because the Brexit vote, I think, activated people in this country, especially young people, in a way that affected the result, the outcome of that result. So ultimately, what I'm saying is that I think that people in this country now have a real alternative from the establishment and the kind of very narrow set of parameters that political parties are offering. And I think that offers us as a chance to be able to redefine and reword and rework how it is we make an offer to people that leaving Europe isn't the solution.
Thank you, Clive. Right, before we open it up to the floor, Suzanne.
Okay, I'm just going to talk about some of the culture and the language around this and how we speak to each other if we're going to make the argument. I also picked up the Brian Eno quote that's in Anthony's book about he talks about the revolution brewing, but not realising, because Eno thinks that he was the revolution. And I think this is part of the problem, that we still don't know whether this is a progressive or a conservative moment, as everyone said, to the desire for change, which this vote was about. There is a desire for change. Lots of this shock, I was shocked by the shock about Brexit, and that's because I think I live in Stoke Newington, which is, of course, the heart of the metropolitan elite. And I was pretty Brexity. I've got a lot of quite Brexit feelings, although I did vote Remain in the end because my children forced me to. But the day after the vote, all my neighbours, they'd all had Remain posters in their windows, and the next day after the vote, they all turned them round and did the sad emoji face on there. And that's pretty much, to me, where Remain has stayed, as a sad emoji, and that's something else. And this is why Anthony's book is talking about rage and sort of pushing people forward. We just can't be in the sad face bit, but I mean, a lot of people still are. And two things came to me from the sad emoji face, and one was the absolute complacency of the Remain campaign, and also I still hate the name. It's the worst name of any campaign I've ever heard. If you love me, remain with me. No. If you love me, stay with me. Keep. Any word would have been better. Leave is active, it's dramatic. Stay is, we've just got to have a better word. I'm sorry, we need a rebrand. You just do. The forces that Anthony describes in his book that were ramping up, that made people vote leave, are still there. And in many ways, Remainers are still doing that thing where they tell people that not only did they vote for the wrong thing, but they had the wrong feelings about the wrong thing and the wrong values. And this is not, to me, an argument. The hope then is simply that these people die. This is not politics of seduction, but it's a cull. I mean, that's what the argument has become. And there's nothing positive in this. And, I don't know what the latest polls are, but not everybody is that regretful about it. A lot of people just want it to be, to people to get on with it. And the obvious fact is that we cannot just keep talking about leavers as racist, old and stupid, or usually all three. The obvious fact is a vast section of the country did not feel included in this country's wealth or in this country's future. And this is something, and so to further exclude people is something that we should really avoid doing, and we shouldn't do it in the language that we use. We have to find some shared values. I'm sorry, I know that sounds a bit hippie, but I don't see any other way. And some of these shared values are in crisis. I mean, I read a thing the other day about how, it does relate to the economic situation, that the economy of Sheffield, for instance, collapsed faster than the economy of Greece, and nobody really talks about it. And some of this is obviously about accountability, some of it's about austerity, but it is also about our place in the world, and it is about belonging, and it is emotional. And that's why all the economic arguments and this kind of terrible sort of AC Grayling, rational, these are the facts, you listen to this and I will correct you argument just doesn't work. It doesn't work. And I have to say, as someone with my Brexit tendencies, I was feeling totally patronised by the time of the vote. Every single political party, the bankers, nearly all the commentators were saying, you mustn't vote leave, are you mad? And then The Guardian, of course, had a procession of musicians, artists, television stars, film directors telling you not to vote leave. And I've never seen the establishment so united, the political and cultural establishment united, and it really did make me want to stick two fingers up. So the entire cultural establishment, and I include journalism, of course, has to look at itself. It has not represented the views of many people in this country at all. So why was it a shock? Because after Scotland, after the referendum in Scotland, it was obvious that many English people were saying during the bid for Scottish independence, well, go away, we don't care anyway. So we are not a united kingdom. The idea of sovereignty then is one that the left continues to patronise the rest of the country about. I mean, I believe in autonomy, I believe in self-determination, direct democracy, accountable government, and I think it's only from that position, as Anthony sort of argues, I think, in the book, I hope I'm not paraphrasing, but from that secure position of identity, you can then make your supranational national bodies like the EU. But the insecurity of the English becomes a rage because people feel both the loss of control and the lack of care. And then they start craving the identities, the old identities that are dormant or residual. The issue then for the culture, which is, and this is a big ask, is to remake the culture, to remake Englishness. You know, whether you're PJ Harvey or whether you're Jez Butterworth or, you know, whether you're Stormzy, you're English and you're talking about English culture. And the fear of Englishness that we have often on the left, I think, means that we just end up with a Britishness that is fundamentally a lie now. This Britishness. We are not a united kingdom. People did not care about what happened in Ireland during this vote, on both sides, to be honest. So I see some of this stuff as a kind of return of the repressed. If you repress all these feelings about wanting a belonging, if you repress everything about Englishness and say it's racist, then you end up here. And the fluidity of identity that everybody sort of wants is actually a sign of cultural capital. And what we've actually had is a recession in cultural capital. Those who have cultural capital will not see those who don't have it or value them. So how can we bridge values between these two camps? I think, and I was just thinking about it today, I mean, I think you just have to change the language. I mean, there is a limit to how much people can read about Brexit negotiations. I mean, there is. And I just asked today on Twitter whether Bake Off, because you're all missing Bake Off was Brexit.
We know who's won now, though.
Oh, but yeah, I don't don't tell me now. But Brexit, and the answers were great. You know, some people said, well, all baked goods are Brexit. Other people said all bunting is Brexit. Some people said that Prue Leith is metropolitan elite, but Mary Berry is Brexit. You know, so it was like poor Hollywood was probably Brexit from his villa in the Algarve. So, you know, and yet the creator of the show, of course, is firmly Remain. And when Nadia Hussein won, the Daily Mail went mad, more mad. Melanie Phillips went more mad. You know, we have so you've got this incredible symbol of the English, but in fact, it's slightly kind of pulling in other things. So if we can classify people like this, and if we can give people a cultural purchase on the argument, then we can have a much more nuanced argument about what it is to be European or what it is to be English than just this kind of hammering out that's going on in the moment of the kind of details of the treaties. I think we're going to lose a lot of people. We have to establish how people can feel safe in this debate, how they can feel safe in Europe, and we have to understand the sadness and loss. I think, you know, that take the Green slogan about thinking globally and acting locally is exactly what will help us to kind of move to that argument. And when Caroline was talking about confidence and risk, I mean, I think we can only have confidence to talk to people, to think that we can pull them over to our side if we talk a language that resonates with them. Thanks.
Okay, I just want to ask two questions following up some of that very briefly, and I'm going to be a bit rude. So, Clive, you talked, as Caroline did, about the idea of a ratification vote, and in the course of the debate, hypothetically leading up to that, making sure that we're going to nail it, the people who would like Britain somehow not to leave the European Union. But I'm curious to know, and I think there's a sort of elephant in the room here, about what exactly will be the political vehicle that sits at the centre of all that. Because, with respect, your leadership, the Labour Party, don't seem very enthusiastic about a great deal of what you've just said, any of it, I would argue. And Caroline, who's my favourite MP, there's only one of you. and the Liberal Democrats, well, really, right? So, in that context, can someone give me a sense of and this is a serious question, what the political vehicle might be which sort of sits in the vanguard and in the centre of turning this round? Because I don't see it right now.
Sorry, speechless. I think that Labour will find it is in their interests to support a ratification referendum. I can't see how they're going to continue riding two horses. They've done it pretty well, the Labour leadership.
Corbyn is asked that question, he says he's not having what he calls a second referendum. And we all know his voting record over 100 years on the EU.
He has changed his mind on things before. I think that if public opinion changes, and if particularly the young people who were shouting his name at Glastonbury, confidently believing, I am sure, that he was somebody who was going to be standing up for the values that I think are at the heart of the EU. I think he basically managed to pull off an extraordinary trick, in a sense, of making people project onto him what they wanted to see there. But we know he depends on a huge number of young people who have flocked to Labour at this last election. We know, well, we don't know, but we think that perhaps public opinion might shift over the coming months. And we know for sure that right now Labour has got an incredibly difficult problem of uniting the views of the MPs who are from what were traditionally Leave constituencies and the ones from Remain. And to me, if I were him, then I would think that putting it back to the people might be a very convenient way of trying to reconcile some of those very real difficulties.
Clive, briefly.
I agree with that. I think events, dear boy, events. I think things are moving so fast and so quickly, and I also think the economy. So where the public are and the space that they make will be space that the Labour Party can then move into. Because I think they're risk averse. We are risk averse because I think, I remember being sat in the room with Jeremy when we were saying, well, we won't come last. We're trying not to come last. He's now in a position where he's like, he can taste 10 Downing Street. And so therefore they are risk averse. And so they want to do whatever it will take. You have to remember, for some people, Europe is a sideshow. It is about getting into number 10 and getting into power. That is the priority over everything else. And if you understand that, then you understand that if that space is made because of economic conditions, I think primarily, as the Conservative Party begin to implode, people begin to see that the project could come apart and then Labour will move into that space. Ultimately, though, I think what this comes down to, or what ultimately comes down to, are the facts that to be able to do the kind of things that John and Jeremy and the Labour Party want to do, the fiscal challenges that will present, there will be increasingly less and less alternative for them than other than to stay as close to Europe as possible. Because to build the socialism that they want to, and I think quite rightly, there's nothing worse than David Davis getting the car keys and going with a smashed car there, build your socialism out of that. And I think that is a fear that is growing within the Labour Party, that is what will happen. And I think that will change minds accordingly.
Okay, let me ask you about Anthony and Suzanne. Suzanne first, and then Anthony, about another elephant in the room. As much as the likes of us could rebrand this as a ratification vote, there is also in this conversation, always it seems to me, a large element of wishful thinking about the likely drift of a large swathe of public opinion. I was in Gillingham in Kent 2 weeks ago. Nobody there, which voted 64% for Leave, is moving. Just about everybody I spoke to said what you hear in Brexit voting constituencies whenever I visit them anyway, which is, why aren't we out already? That's what people say. And they say it very often with a passion, maybe less so in Gillingham, but certainly in places like Merthyr Tydfil in Wales or Stoke-on-Trent, or northern Manchester, because no one listened to those people for 70 or 80 years, literally as long as that. And then they had a say, and they invested a great deal of hope in it. Ed Miliband says, quite rightly, that in Doncaster, Brexit is the one thing he's heard people be politically optimistic about for as long as he's been the MP there, right? Now, that's a lot, don't tweet that. That's a lot to mess with. It's a hell of a sensitivity to sort of toy with, isn't it, really? And I wonder whether, in the midst of this conversation, we're constantly in danger of underrating that. Suzanne first, then Anthony.
Well, when I leave Stoke Newington, this is how, which is sometimes, is how I feel that most people. That's my sense too. That most people this is dropped on their list of priorities for a start. Brexit is not their big priority, and that they just want it to happen. And they're a little bit angry that the government isn't sorting it out fast enough. But no, I don't think you can rely on any other vote producing a different result. And I think it is wishful thinking. Yeah.
How much would you, Anthony, fear a huge backlash if it was even proposed in mainstream politics that somehow we have another vote or we question what's going to happen?
I think it's quite likely over the next year that there will be, as the economic consequences intensify, a crumbling of support. And it may be that support then goes down to 30 or 35%, which is sufficient, if you like. It starts to hit the marginal constituencies, it starts to hit the MPs. The MPs, I hope, are being told, we're really worried about this. So a Westminster process of saying it will be safe to abandon it could take place. But unless, this is my view, so I would rather we were in Europe having this argument than out of Europe having this argument. But unless there is also a really coherent, positive case about why we're in Europe and what this is about that can answer what these people's, I think the NHS, for example, which has become, it's a sort of the last symbol of this is our country. And, they can't mess around with our bodies. They're not going to charge for it. We're safe. And if they feel that if that system starts to go, then that's one thing where people say, okay, we've got to do it to save the NHS. But there has to be something positive about this. And if there isn't, then, political parties can mushroom, especially as sort of, there are fascists mobilizing on the streets, and there's the whole question of immigration is there. So this is a very, very dangerous situation to enter into. And if the political parties in Westminster are going around to you thinking that they can solve the question of Europe by sort of technically getting out of Article 50, but there isn't a real coherent politics on it, then the right will move into that space.
Okay, listen, I'll come back when I take some questions, Clive, because I know time's ticking on. So we will take questions, points, not speeches, ideally, in sort of groups of 3. That's not the old New Labour trick of making sure that some of them will go unanswered. I assure you, some of these questions, all of these questions will be answered, okay? Right, so, and I'll try and keep everything gender balanced. So woman at the front, and then there's a hand at the back there. There are roving microphones.
Hi.
Fire away.
I don't think this is, maybe it's on, yes. My name is Monica Threlfall. I'm a great enthusiast for Europe and appreciate much of what the EU has done. And I do agree that our press in particular have not managed to say anything very positive about the EU for a very long time, or discuss its programs and its projects and its investments. Seriously. So my question is, could you see yourselves signing up to a document which actually says a few positive things about what the EU has done, something that you think every politician could agree, every Remainer politician could agree around, a few facts, a few quotes, a few nice stories, whatever. Could you even agree on saying, we support the EU because it does a whole lot of good things, and these are some examples?
Okay. And then there was a hand at the... How many microphones have we got? 2. Okay, so then, gentleman standing up at the back.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that John was saying. So the question's more directed to Clive and Caroline, I think, than the other members of the panel. And it just seems that I'm a journalist, and I sort of instinctively voted Remain in the referendum, but I'm trying to look at the situation as pragmatically as possible now as a journalist. And what I see with the situation now is that in terms of Remain and soft Brexit, that they are two very distinct parts. And if you are campaigning for Remain, then in some ways you are undermining the soft Brexit case as it stands now. Because the weaker the withdrawal deal, the more likely it is to be rejected, the more likely it is to lead to a second referendum. So there seems to be a sort of decision that needs to be made there about whether people are campaigning for Remain or whether they're campaigning for soft Brexit, because I don't think they go together.
And just on by way of clarification, by a soft Brexit, do you mean the European Economic Area and staying in the customs union?
I don't. I mean like the softest Brexit that seems reasonable now. So immediately post-referendum, possibly the EEA. But with the government policy as it is, you're talking about the political vehicle. The Labour Party policy on Brexit is essentially the same as the government's policy
things
on
have
Brexit.
shifted. A long transition deal now is presented as soft Brexit. It just strikes me as putting a plank that goes over the cliff so the bus drops off it slightly later.
Sorry, what's that? I mean, as I see it, like soft Brexit, as immediately post-referendum, was possibly staying in the single market.
Okay.
Now the government policy is against that. Labour policy is also against staying in the single market, against retaining freedom of movement. So there is the softest Brexit possible policy, which is the government's policy. Just to elaborate slightly.
No, come on, you've gone on far too long, sir, sorry. I think it's a great question and I will make sure it is answered. Can we have a question from a woman, if at all possible? Yes, here, down the front.
Hello. I'd like to very much support what Caroline Lucas was saying about how it seems to me the young have been betrayed by the pack of lies, really on both sides, that came with the referendum. But my question is, given that, in my view, certainly, and I believe it's obviously Caroline Lucas's view too, it is indeed the younger generation that's going to be screwed by us leaving Europe. But what I find very, very strange is, why is there no movement in the universities? I mean, there's been this daft letter, but where are the demonstrations? Why aren't the young aware that actually what's going on is really, really serious for their futures? And yet, in the universities in particular, we seem to see nothing. Perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps there are demonstrations, but certainly as far as the press is concerned, the general press, one doesn't hear about it.
Okay, so Clive first. Can you start with that point? It's an interesting point, isn't it? That if there is too much campaigning for staying in somehow and nullifying or overturning the result of the referendum, then the danger is that the soft Brexit baby will be thrown out with the bathwater. A realistic option of avoiding the worst will be lost.
It's a real dilemma. It is, and it's been a real dilemma for me, personally, as to what to pitch and what to talk about and what to get behind. I genuinely feel that, as came out in your discussion, your kind of comments with John then, what is soft Brexit? It changes, and it's constantly changed. So I think all you can do, where I'm trying to pitch myself now as a politician, is to try to bank the transition, bank the single market membership, keep the pressure up on the government, make sure we're in the ECJ. Those things now increasingly seem to be becoming a growing consensus, except for the kind of hardcore of Brexiteers. But also pushing, having things out, riders that are out there, like the ratification vote, not obsessing about them, but making sure those things are out there in the public discourse, that there are alternatives, there are other options other than what the government are talking about. So I am trying to have my cake and eat it. But I just think that what I've found out is that things are moving so quickly. There were things that would be impossible for us to say now as a party and me individually, straight off the back of the referendum, which now we can all talk about. Things have moved quite significantly, and I don't know how far and how fast they'll move in the future. So I think all we can do now is say the bare minimum, which for me is the soft Brexit option, the transitional process, and the bare minimum retaining that longer term, but also saying things are moving so quickly in terms of economically, in terms of what the other EU states are saying, in terms of where the Conservative Party is imploding and how long they'll last for, how long Theresa May will be there. Things are constantly shifting, and it's just about constantly pushing things a little bit further, just so that political space is there that my own leadership can move into, and the public can actually say, well, that actually now, at a time of great transition and change, actually makes sense, when 2 months ago, it wouldn't. I can bet my bottom dollar now that in 3 months' time, this conversation, some elements of it, will be redundant.
Okay. Anthony, I know you want to answer that first point, about whether the basis of this might be something completely lacking or largely lacking from the so-called Remain campaign during the referendum, which is some fairly strong statements about why the EU is a good thing, because I didn't hear many.
I mean, I'd love that to be the case. And I'd love it to be the case that we can sort of shift the argument with the economic movement in the way that Clive has just described. But I want to emphasize because that's what I would like to happen, the dangers. If you produce a strong statement saying these are all the wonderful things that the European Union has done, the people of England are just going to think, who are you talking to? And this question of England, I mean, I've just done a little thing in Huffington Post, you know, I've breached the thing being disloyal to open democracy in response to an argument of Lisa Nandy, who's the Labour MP for Wigan. And she wrote a piece in there called England Beneath the Surface. And I compared Wigan to Paisley in Scotland. This is just to dramatise the English element of what is happening. So these are two heroic industrial towns that were triumphant at the end of the 19th century and are now very penury and is quite steep decline. They're more or less the same size. Wigan is about 94,000, Paisley is about 76, but the larger areas are also that sort of equivalent. They both had record 69.3% turnouts, which for depressed working class areas is a very high turnout in the referendum. They both had 64% majorities in the referendum. But in Scotland, it was for Remain, and in England, it was for Leave. So these are mirror communities. The figures are absolutely striking. And therefore, you're dealing with a nation which says, what kind of country are we? And producing for the people of England a list of all the wonderful things the EU has done, they're not going to hear it. You've not registered the force. So what we have to do is we have to say, this is the kind of country we are, and this is where this country needs to go. And we have to address that fully and wholeheartedly. And when you raise the question also of the media, and one of the things that happened in the referendum is that the Leave campaign, it wasn't just Cambridge Analytica and Facebook stuff. They were running quite long, for me, absolutely impossible videos of an hour and a half on the European Court and so on, the Brexit, the movie, which were watched by millions of people. So there's an English viewership, an English hunger, which can be addressed. And we've got to address that. And whatever, all the pushing that Clive is talking about, and we're shifting what can be said in Parliament, and we're shifting the political class, and that's great, and we can sort of diminish the damage that it's doing. But the point that Suzanne is talking about, we've got to address that. And if we don't, it will be captured by the right, and they will come back really hard.
So to be very clear, to talk in terms about England at last.
You've got to. I mean, England took us out, and England's got to take us back in. England is a European country. And fine, England is the country of Shakespeare, and we don't need to be frightened of England. The reason why England is a hooligan, right, is that it's caged inside this Westminster system. And we're perpetuating the hooliganism. And in some way...
I'm just going to say that the time scale for this, though, where you're talking about, is not going to run to the timescale of the negotiations. If we're being honest,
to begin to turn around that conversation about England will take a lot longer.
No, I think you're right. I'm just saying the timescale isn't one that's going to be condzive to what's happening with Article 50 and.
Fine, but if we don't start now,
don't just say fine. That's a big point.
No, it's.
The big point is you cannot possibly repossess the notion of England for the left in about 18 months, which is all you've got.
Of course you can't. But you've got to take it on. It won't. The right, they're going to come through with this. So one of the things you have to do in parallel is be preparing ourselves for this fight.
Have you got enough profile to do that? Because again, you see, I see Jeremy Corbyn, for all his great strengths and the fact he's restored moral clarity to left politics and all the rest of it, I don't see him being terribly comfortable with talking about England. Because he thinks people with St George's flags, I don't know.
Caroline, you've got other people who will have to step forward.
He's the leader of the opposition. He's going to have to be in this, isn't he?
Yeah, this is the question to Clive.
I'm going to ask him. I'm going to
phone him up. How are you with England today, Jeremy? Have you lost your knee-jerk leftist suspicions of it? Suzanne, I want to come to you about this point about young people, because you live with a few of them.
Yes.
My kids are 11 and 8. You know, they haven't really got any opinions about Brexit yet. Although, no, that's not quite true. But it's not quite true, is it, that they're sort of fatalistic and not making a noise about this?
Well, I was trying to think about it when you were asking the question about, it was a bit like they're not doing what they should be doing. They should be out on the streets. They could have been out on the streets every day for the last 10 years on tuition fees, on their terrible high rents. And, they've been shat on from on high in so many ways, young people, that I think Brexit. I mean, I can only talk about the kids I've got 3 daughters. I think probably they've been more hit by the election of Trump. That is something that they were very, that signalled like the end of the world much more than Brexit did to them. That's just the kind of, I really noticed with kids, I'm sure you all do as well, that they don't really make a distinction between English news and American news. They're just watching YouTube, so it doesn't matter whether it's coming from Chicago or whether it's coming from, Stockwell. Their sense of what's happening in the world is different, and a lot of what happens in America is more important to them than what happens here. But in the sense of, just practical home ownership, all the things that they've suffered from this generation, I think it's just Brexit is just another thing, and I think that's why people can get in a field in Glastonbury and sing Jeremy Corbyn and not have really any idea what Jeremy Corbyn's position on this is, because that's not the most important thing. Because otherwise, how could they do it? Oh, drunk, obviously, but
Glastonbury, wasn't it? Exactly. Caroline, I'll come to you after these next load of points just to get some more in. So can we have 3 more? John down the front, and then you there, please. Okay.
I'm John McTurnan. I'm one of the establishment that brought us here. According to Anthony, and I think he's right. I think New Labour were accidentally the handmaiden for the referendum. But I suppose we all now know what it feels like to lose our country, which is the rage that has driven some of the votes on the Brexit side. I agree with Anthony that we have to fight. I'm not pessimistic. I think you can change a country in 18 months. Look what Jeremy Corbyn did in 6 weeks in the election campaign. Even the beginning of the election campaign didn't look like this would happen. England was brought to the left by Jeremy Corbyn. England can be brought back to Brexit by the Labour Party. But all I've heard in terms of suggestions, my question is this. What is the heart of a campaign to take England back? Because constitutional change is process. Regional devolution is process. What is the social side of this? It's a socio-economic problem. What's the identity? What's the progressive identity politics?
Great question. Yeah. Right, and then the woman there.
Hi. I'm not from here, as you can tell by my voice.
You're from the place that's got it even worse than us.
Yeah, I'm from there, but I'm from Scotland originally, and so is my mom's side of the family. And I was sort of wondering what your thoughts were on how the non-English countries of the UK, so Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, how they're going to proceed post-Brexit and what Brexit means for them, because obviously Scotland's already making moves to leave the UK, and so what's going to happen from there for everyone else?
Another great question, and then there was somebody over here you alerted me to. Peter, are you there? Not that we're choosing our friends or anything, but you're Peter, far away.
No, I just wanted to back up and ask both Clive, all of you really, you're saying that the constitutional, the immediate political framework doesn't allow us to change England or Britain and things like that. But I've been watching that for 30 years, and 30 years ago we were going to change Charter 88, and we're back to where we were. And I'm just wondering if actually we're not addressing the bigger problem of Brexit, which is really what Anthony's book is about, is that Britain is leaving the world stage as the unitary nation state we know it. And it's becoming more like the former Yugoslavia. Bosnian friends of mine say it's got all the qualities of that, and the former UK spells out fuck. So I'm just wondering if we're not addressing the problem.
I didn't catch that last.
I'm not sure I understand that question. Can you?
What did you say? The
Four ways UK is fuck.
Oh, I see.
Is Britain
As a unitary state.
okay? Okay. Caroline, I said I'd come to you first. Let's take John McTernan's question. What should be at the heart of a campaign to take England back?
It's a bloody good question. And I think part of it's got to come down to addressing some of the reasons that people not only felt left behind, and I hate that phrase about feeling left behind because it makes it sound like it was some accidental byproduct of a system that was otherwise working perfectly well, and oops, by the way, we've just left those people behind, let's go and scoop them up. No, the kind of neoliberal globalization that we have depends on winners and losers, and a number of marginalized people are the collateral damage of an economic system that we have been pursuing for a number of years. So, unfortunately, that doesn't get turned around quickly, but at least by naming the problem, maybe we've got a better chance of beginning to address some of the solutions, and in particular, I think identifying the fact that if you are fighting against that marginalization, if you're fighting against this process of neoliberalism, which has then been exacerbated by austerity, all of that is made more difficult, arguably, if you are not inside the EU. Now, I appreciate that is a difficult case to make to people who have been told for years that the problem is elsewhere. And I think, when we've been talking about the media just now, we've got to recognize that the EU has been scapegoated for decades. For whenever there's a problem, it's the EU. And, it's been a really convenient scapegoat for successive governments. So it's quite hard to begin to actually say to people that the reason that you don't have a secure job, or the reason that you are in a long waiting list to see your doctor, or that that you don't have a decent place to live in, has got nothing to do with the EU. And in fact, the economic damage that leaving the EU is likely to bring with it is going to make it even harder to address those issues. Those issues are about the fact that your voice hasn't been heard in the political process that we have here now, challenging that economic system that has, I would argue, deliberately, systematically led to some of those outcomes.
What if you live in a place, though, in which for years, post the decline of coal mines or steelworks, there's been a low-wage economy, opportunities have been very thin on the ground, and then, because of free movement of people, your town then has become host to a community of people from EU countries, which you feel somehow has sustained that low-wage economy and those lack of opportunities. In that sense, the EU kind of was what people were voting about in a lot of places, wasn't it?
But I think your words "you feel" are kind of crucial in that sentence. And I want, in terms of what we do in the meantime, which was one of the questions that Clive posed earlier, I think in the meantime, what I would like to see, this doesn't answer your question directly, and we'd need to do it pretty carefully, but I still want to see a campaign that stands up for freedom of movement and makes the case that it's a wonderful thing to be able to study and to work and to live and to love in 27 other member states, and that is not the cause of people's problems. Those EU citizens are actually bringing resources into our country. The reason that there are public services still operating is because we've got EU citizens working in them. And these are big issues to turn around, because again, for years it's been convenient to blame people coming in from outside for the fact that successive governments haven't properly implemented a minimum wage, haven't increased that minimum wage, haven't stepped up when there have been abuses of employment practices and so on. But I just want to come back to one thing, because I kind of feel, and maybe this is a bit of a cheat, but you said, what's the substance of this campaign? Because PR or devolution or English identity are process. And I want to make the case that I guess in some senses process and substance are so interlinked, because so much of this does come back to having a voice. And that means I don't think we go off to Merthyr Tydfil or Dagenham and march through the streets saying, what do we want, the additional member system, what do we want it now? No. But I too think we talk about how people's voices have not been heard. 68% of the votes that were cast in this election just gone were effectively wasted in our system. They counted not a jot towards the outcome. And I think we've got to be clear about that and find the language, and I appreciate we haven't got it yet, but pretty quickly find some of the language to talk about that in a way that is resonant and not academic and irrelevant.
Clive, Same question. What's at the heart of a campaign to take England back in 18 months flat?
I think the Labour Party has touched on it. I think it has to be about new institutions, national institutions. If you think about the last 30, 35 years, so many of the institutions that have forged our national identity in the post-war period, the welfare state itself, the NHS, the BBC in some ways, they've been under attack, they've been undermined, they've been diminished, and I think these are some of the functions which hold us together. So I think there's so much scope, especially with the changing nature of our economy, the fact that it's already having an impact on the kind of conditions that people work in, the contracts that they have, the terms and conditions that they have. I think the National Education Service that the Labour Party have talked about has the potential to be the kind of 21st century equivalent of the NHS. It really could be something dramatic which changes people's lives. Education and training, arts and culture, lifelong, throughout your entire life, accessible to all. I think there are certain things that we need to understand and what create a sense of identity and Englishness. And they've been under attack for 35 years. It wasn't just our economic rights, it's also the things which held us together, or the things which made us feel like we were part of a common collective. They've been undermined. So I think rebuilding those, the Conservatives are never going to do that. That's going to have to come from the Labour Party. So I think also as well, and this is more academic, but also coming to terms with Englishness. It's something really difficult as a black man in this country. I understand the dangers. I understand for some how that can be a difficult thing. But I'm also someone who's been in the army. I'm also someone very proud to be a part of this country. But what is our English identity, and why can't we embrace it? Why can't we take responsibility for that and shape that? And the reason I say that is because we're going through a kind of, I think, we look back in history. We will see that we're going through the kind of closing stages of the end of empire. It's not something which is just in the history books. We're going through it still. Our place in the world, what do we represent? Who are we? And if you understand the kind of history of the British state, the United Kingdom was established in effect, in the last 250 years, to kind of control the empire, to build the colonies, to kind of man those different parts of the empire. So that's gone, and therefore you could also argue that in many ways a raison d'etre for the United Kingdom has gone. And how do we begin to redefine that? How do we begin to work out what Englishness is? So I think for the Labour Party, one of the things I think is something that we can be talking about is, let's have an English Labour Party. Let's start talking about that. Let's start trying to reconnect with people and saying, we understand that people are going through a process of a real period of, what am I? Who are we? What do we represent? What do we stand for? Where is my place in this? What's my part in it? And until we can begin answering those questions, I'm not sure we can do it in 18 months, but we can have a good crack at it.
I'll come to Anthony after. Suzanne, I'm right in saying, aren't I, that there aren't many of us, people who write for The Guardian, who are all right self-describing as English and talking about England and all that stuff.
No, it's not.
It's about 3 of us, I think. You're one of those people, aren't you?
Yeah,
two, I think.
I don't know.
Who's me and Suzanne, that's it?
That's it.
Yeah, George Monbiot's all right with England. I'll see if we can get him on the phone and check that, but I think he is. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm okay with about being English. I'm actually half American. But yeah, I know when I'm in America that I'm English. It's like, that's what I am. I don't consider it like a mono sort of identity. But I was just thinking, I agree with what Clive said about the situation. I've never ever said UK. I never say British, because to me that's a colonial identity, and I just don't say it. I'm English. I think people in Scotland are Scottish. I think people in Wales are Welsh. I think that's how I feel. I've always felt like that. But I was just thinking when Clive was talking about, yes, 18 months is not long to shift a culture vastly, but things can move very fast. And it was only in 2012 that Danny Boyle did give us a kind of celebration of what it was to be in this country. That, and okay, not everybody loved the Olympics, but.
In 5 years it'll be gone.
Well, that's a very strong argument to tell people. I would get Danny Boyle or somebody like Danny Boyle on board, because everyone says, how do we celebrate this, or we don't want to offend somebody. you know, you just go for it. And that's what he did. And he had massive support from the people who, you know, he's working with. So I don't think it's so impossible to talk about identity, as long as you do it in such a way that if people say, no, that bit isn't for me, then that's still okay. I think you open up identity rather than sort of close it down.
It always amazes me that people, particularly in cities perhaps, and London more than anywhere else, deny themselves the opportunity to be involved in the conversation about England. So, I mean, I've had conversations on social media with people in London who say, well, I don't live in England, I'm not English. I say, well, where's London then? Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
And somehow England becomes equated with Boston and Lincolnshire or you know, Great Yarmouth or whatever, you know, places that voted UKIP, that are, somehow it's synonymous with the east of England in some way. And people miss out.
I come from Suffolk, so...
Bristol's in England, Manchester's in England, London's in England. We missed that. Anthony, the two questions we haven't touched on. First of all, what of Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland? And then this question of, is Britain the unitary state actually leaving the world now?
Leading or leaving?
Leaving. It was leaving, wasn't it? Yes, I thought it was.
So let me to answer those two, I want to just start with John's point about process. Take back. There's a classic political trope which goes, people are only interested in real things, the tangible, housing and so on. They're not interested in constitutional process. Take back control was process. And what we say is, it's time to take the bastards out, if I can put it out. Let's take back control. But let's really take back control of our NHS. Let's really take back control of our local government. Let's really get rid of Westminster and all that structure of the old Westminster state. That's the message. Now, how you know, if the energy and the cultural energy went into that message, yes, we could turn the country around. But it needs focus and support and funding.
Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland.
Well, my view that I argue is that there are two different possibilities. So there was the Danny Boyle Britishness, the open, pluralistic, progressive, and I think Brexit has torpedoed that. I think Brexit has become Britishness. I think that form of very attractive global Britishness, which was suddenly emerging, was hit first by the crash and now by Brexit. But if it could be reconstituted in a pluralistic way and people wanted it, fine. But the other alternative is for England to say to the other countries of the Union, we should all be independent together. Not as an aggressive, if you just take the Scottish referendum, if in Scotland the English had said to Scotland, sure, we'll help you be independent. We'd like that. You know, we'll cooperate. It's not going to be taken as a hostile act. We're not having a Catalonia type situation. We're not going to cut off your funding. We're the richer country. Let's do it together. Then, of course, the Scots would have voted for independence, because a very large number of the Scots said, I'm for it, but not yet. We're not ready yet. We're not strong enough. Not in these circumstances. It's not a hostile action. So if we in England want that, we're strong and big enough to achieve that in a cooperative way, which isn't destructive. And the Welsh, I don't know about the Welsh, it's rather complicated, but the Scots would rise to it, and Northern Ireland would join Ireland, and it would. This is available. This is available to us.
Oh, just like that.
Just like that.
Really?
Yes.
The Battle of the Boyne and all that. We just consign all that to history. Never mind all that.
Because by international treaty, we
you feel the hand of history on your shoulders.
We have agreed to the fact that a majority in Northern Ireland can join the South. That's there by international treaty.
And all those unionists would just accept that and knuckle under, wouldn't they, after all?
It's not there yet. It's a different situation. I mean, you're asking me, but I think what's important here is to imagine, you know, look how fast things have changed, but the speed of change has been negative, but the speed of change can be positive.
And this point here about, is Britain the unitary state leaving with a V the world?
I think the United Kingdom, this is where, if Brexit sees Britishness, but Brexit is clearly a failing project. And the dream of Brexit is a global Britain that can trade freely. You know, it's sort of Boris Johnson, well, if you could run India with a smaller civil service and we've got now, you could do this or you could do that. And this, I think is very important. We've been talking about kind of working class and the impoverished and the insecure. But Brexit is ideologically driven by a kind of Tory love. This is the lure of greatness, funded by hedge funds. You know, Rees-Mogg, his father was the editor of the Times, is a classic. He said, I think this came up about Europe, about America. He said, I feel closer to America. The Atlantic is for me smaller than the Channel. And this is hedge fund money. He's worth 50 million. He's a hedge fund, runs a hedge fund. Father's editor of the Times. He represents that kind of desire for that Britishness, and that's that source, and that is in global terms, it's a fantasy, and everybody thinks it's absurd. And if you go anywhere in the world, people just think, what is this about? So yes, it's leaving the world.
Just by way of sort of illustrating what we're talking about, this is slightly crass, but let's take a straw poll. How many people here are comfortable with the idea that they are English? I am now. How many people here would be more comfortable self-describing as British? Okay, you've got work to do, haven't you? Right, another 3 questions.
That's a really thorough inquiry.
Okay, so what's missing? Are you one of those people who say you're European? I live in Somerset. I don't know any of those people, but.
I am British because I am not English.
Because well?
I'm British because I'm not.
Well, that's all right, but then you would self-describe as British, wouldn't you? If you had to. Okay, how many people are comfortable with neither identity, British or English?
What are these people?
Okay, no, I understand that.
Because you don't have a single identity, you have multiple identities. I'm English, but my family came from Scotland and Ireland. So I can't be anything but British and English and Scottish and Irish and European.
This is good. Keep going. Go on.
Ask how many of us feel European.
How many people here feel as your primary identity? Or it's a strong part of your identity that you're European? Okay. Okay.
Interesting. So you get people, how many have both? Or it's
this is very complicated.
Welcome to our world.
Can I make one point?
Go on.
I mean, I completely accept. It was Misha who was saying that, you know, we're pluralistic. I'm not, for example, I'm not for an English Parliament because we've got a House of the Common People called the House of Commons, so which is not an exclusive term. I mean, it's an inclusive one. And of course, it's the case that we're talking about identities which are pluralistic, not exclusive. So I completely accept that point, and I don't want in any way to be put into a thing of saying we're English, you know, we're against all the other nations and we must be exclusive. And you know, I'm not for saying we should have an English parliament. I think and we should draw on that. And Englishness itself, because of its imperial experience and its language, is a very pluralistic and open culture compared to other European cultures, and that's a treasure. So I don't think that Englishness is being seen as something which is sort of exclusive, but it's up for us to make that.
I mean, I supported Scottish independence for Scotland because I'm English. I mean, and I'm not. I want people to decide for themselves. So to me, these are not. This is not a sort of contest.
That was a cheap shot, but it got a debate started. Right, 3 more questions or points. So, woman in the black and white striped top there.
You still haven't told me what I'm going to say to the friend of mine who said, I voted Brexit because I want to take control of borders. It's still the one thing that I think is driving some of the maintenance of Brexit, that we we must go swiftly to a point where we have control of borders. And yet all of that seems founded on lies about how immigration was happening. And you hear about, in Belgium, if you haven't got a job after you've been there for 3 months, you are actually, first of all, you have to register, and then you have to have a job. There's a lot of lies about what free movement meant, and that they've got to be, can they be dealt with more quickly in the period leading to transition? Because it just seems to me that they were still in living that lie of Brexit means total control of borders.
Okay, gentlemen there, white cuffs. Far away.
It's Henry Porter. I run a site called Brexit Record, which aggregates economic news on Brexit. And one of the really, really impressive things about reading these every morning is you can see it is happening. Small firms relocating, downsizing, re-headquartering in Europe. I want to bring it back to the economic argument because I am absolutely certain that Brexit will result in a greater gap between rich and poor. And I wonder why the Labour Party doesn't take that ball and run with it.
Okay. And then one more woman at the back, I think, black top.
Okay, so over the course of this evening, we've heard that the left is going to do the following. 1, they're going to listen to people who voted leave. 2, they're going to say that we're going to solve all our domestic problems politically. We're going to, bring in proportional representation. We're going to make it more democratic. 3, we're going to also reform the EU before we go back in to get rid of this, neoliberal hegemony. This is terrible. We're also going to do this. And 4, we're going to show how the above 3 are all made easier by being within the EU, not out of it. Now, I want the panel to answer this following question. So quite a lot over the past few weeks, I've heard campaigners who are, Remain campaigners being told, when you go to the doorsteps, just look like you're listening, put on your listening face. This is how you look like you're listening. Well, why don't you actually listen? Instead of saying, we get it, yeah, we get it. Maybe you don't get it, maybe you don't know. Maybe you don't understand why people voted leave, and maybe you've not done the analysis. Maybe being in the EU has benefited you, and maybe it hasn't benefited other people. So, as a result of this, I would say, given that the vote was in 2 ways about democracy, it was both a democratic vote and it was about democracy, i.e. take back control, I'd like the panel to answer the following question. In what way can you make the promise of democracy, which was so tantalising to so many people and energised so many people in this referendum, more than just being about the Remainers getting what they want?
Okay. Clive.
The last question, the last point. I think I'm doing that by being in a Labour Party which is championing social and economic justice. That's how I think I'm answering part of that question. But I'm going to say something which isn't really going to be popular for a politician. I'm afraid to say there are some views out there which come from sometimes working class communities. I've got people in my own community back in Northampton where I grew up, on the council estate I grew up, who share them. But quite frankly, I just don't agree with them. And they're wrong. And I'll say so. One of the things I find is a lot of kind of kowtowing and apologising for the fact that we can't offend people. That as politicians we have to listen. Well, I do listen, but sometimes I listen. And if someone says to me, "I'm sorry, Clive, but I think that actually I won the referendum to nuke North Korea, and therefore I think that you should agree with that," then I'm sorry, I think that's a really bad idea. For the following reasons. And even though I lost a referendum on that, to bomb North Korea, I'm still going to argue against it. So the point I'm making is this. There are a lot of people, and I've written down here, on the issue of immigration, there are 2 components to it. And I just take that as an example. I think there are 2 components to immigration and freedom of movement, to touch on this lady's question. There's an economic component, the belief that more people coming into the country and that the jobs are finite, that resources are finite, and that they detract from that, which I think anyone that has a grasp of economics understands is wrong, expressly wrong. And secondly, I'm afraid to say there is a deep-seated racist, xenophobic component to some people's issue on immigration. And we can cover it up as much as we want. And we're told as politicians, I cannot say that there is a component of the immigration question which is not racist. Oh, you're calling those people racist. Well, I'm fucking sorry, yes. For some people, it does come down to that. And there is a long history and reasons to why that is. You don't kind of overturn 400 years of justifying ideology for slavery and empire and colonialism overnight. So I guess, I will always listen to people, but if I think that something is against their interest, against my interest, then I'm going to argue for it. And I'm sorry that I came from where I came from, ended up going to university, drank too many cappuccinos at the BBC, and then now my opinion doesn't count. I will speak my mind, and I will listen. Yeah.
On that, the question about Brexit looking extremely likely, if not absolutely certain, to increase, to widen the gap between the rich and the poor, and why the Labour Party doesn't make more noise about that.
Because the Labour Party doesn't believe that. The Labour Party believes if it wins the next election, it will be able to have, I hate using the phrase, but I will use it, socialism in one country. I don't agree with that, but there are some components of the Labour Party, some components of the leadership who believe that you can, in an interconnected, globalised world, with Europe as our main neighbour, still have a kind of a socialist policies in this country. And, Jeremy has said he believes that there are elements of European policy which prevent us from doing some of the things we want to do. I don't think that's the case. I think he's been sold a pup on that one, and I actually think that everything we want to do, in fact, there's more chance we'll be able to do so many of the things we want to do by doing them in tandem with our European partners, because this will need to be some of the kind of things that John MacDonald and Jeremy want to do at a fiscal level will need coordination with our European allies. So I think the reason they think that isn't the case is because they instinctively believe that if they are elected, they do come into power, they will so radically change the economy that it just simply won't happen, because they can believe they can do that outside of the current structures of Europe that we're in.
Caroline, two of those questions. The first one that was raised at the back, how do you avoid that sort of sectional appearance that really what this is about is the Remainers taking back control? That inevitably there'll be this sort of wall of you're denying me my voice.
Well, I go back to where I started, which was with the referendum on the facts, and by enabling a referendum on the facts, you are precisely giving people a voice again on those final details. Now, when it gets to that point, I'm going to be fighting for Remain for all of the reasons that I did before. But to me, the big issue is enabling that choice to be made, to enable people to see the small print, because, there's a very real chance right now that we could crash out with no deal at all. Now, that is not what was on the ballot paper. Nobody was thinking about that on the 23rd of June. The idea that with, the tariffs at 45% on meat and 10% on cars and whatever it is for cheese and so forth. And, the point of crashing out and what that's going to do to the peace process in Northern Ireland, the fact that Turkey isn't about to join, the fact that, as I say, the NHS is likely to be on its knees because of public services, the number of companies that are going to be leaving Britain, already are leaving Britain, the costs of all of that, I think, are going to become clearer, so that it is right that people have the opportunity to look at the facts of the deal or the no deal, or whatever it is that the Prime Minister comes back with.
Do you worry at all, and this I've spoken to people and read things to this effect recently, and I thought this was worth thinking about, the idea that we all think a no deal, it will be disastrous, but the politics of no deal could really, really help the hard Brexiteers, because they'll be able to present that to Leave voters as, look, the French and the Germans have stitched us up again, this is going to be like the war, and we've all got to rally around the flag. And at that point, a lot of Remain voters might rally to the flag too. It's a very dangerous thing for the pro-EU side, a no deal Brexit, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it is. It's dangerous for that reason, and it's dangerous because of what it will actually mean. But I think it increases the chances, or at least it increases the arguments in favour of saying that the British public should have a right to talk about this. That was, I've sat on panels with Dan Hannan and many other proponents of the Leave campaign who were never talking about that. I mean, Dan Hannan would have said that, you can still be part of the single market, don't be silly, it's all going to be fine. This kind of abrupt cliff edge was not being discussed in that referendum campaign at all, and I think it reinforces the arguments for going back and giving people a say on that.
Suzanne, that question, the woman's friend who still talks about taking control of borders, which again is a sort of non-metropolitan conversation, but I hear it a lot whenever I go to places. What do the pro-EU side, say to people on that score now?
Well, I was struck by that question and the person at the back when Clive was saying that you will say yes, this is wrong, and I'm going to call out racism and I'm going to declare it. There is that side of it, but I think it's there's a lot of fake listening going on, as the person at the back suggested, and I even wonder here, because I occasionally do things like this when it's mostly Remain people, whether they do. Anyone's mind is changed at all. People come, they remain, they leave, they remain. The sad emoji face feeling, right? Because I think that I cannot answer this. I can't answer the question on borders. I can't properly answer that question because yes, I hear it all the time, and yes, of course, once you go out of London, you hear it a lot. There are people who are going to confront it and say, well, I'm just not going to listen to that bit. And there are people who are going to try to make sort of some kind of bridge with it. I think Labour have been have been quite clear on it. But you've got a lot of people saying no, free movement is the price we pay. I mean, that is the Labour position a lot of the time. We will give up a certain amount of free movement. When Caroline was talking, I thought I feel far more passionately about Caroline's pro-immigration movement than I do about the EU. I would get behind a pro-immigration movement in the way that the EU is a bunch of bankers. That is what it is. I would get behind a pro-immigration movement.
It's not just about
but also I think young people would as well. Because,
Can I just stick the environment in here, just because it hasn't been stuck? Well, I would just say that as well as the points about free movement, and thank you for that, I think we can be a bit passionate about the fact that our greatest protections for our seas and our water and our air have come from the EU. The reason that now, finally, in London, air quality is being followed up by government is precisely because of the threats from the EU that are going to be potentially fining them.
Just to finish, and I will give Anthony the last word, because as much as anything, this is an event around your book, Anthony. Is there anything you want to ask each other? Well, don't dry up, please.
No. I want to ask. I'm feeling rather sad about what Clive said about this sort of Lexit. Does the Labour leadership, and how profound a view is that, if they really think that they can build socialism in one country? They've never. I know I've felt this, but I've also felt this is an argument, in say Momentum, where there's the sort of, there's kind of an instinctive pro-European among the young people in Momentum, and then there's the clammy hand of an argument that I thought I was part of defeating in 1975.
So I think to be really clear here, I don't know the minds of John or Jeremy on this exactly. What I do know is that the political philosophies and the positions that they sometimes have taken in the past have been, especially Jeremy, a more Bennite position, which is an anti-European position. But nonetheless, Jeremy has definitely moved. I definitely believed he voted Remain in the referendum, that rubbish that he didn't. And I also believe he understands, I think he also understands that the freedom of movement was something I think he came to accept and actually want to protect and cherish, because as someone who believes in a world with no borders, ultimately is a long-term political objective, which I think is probably where Jeremy's at, he also is a pragmatist to understand that that's not going to happen overnight. But I think what I don't want to do is to kind of convey as if they sit round and say, we believe in socialism in one country. That's clearly they don't. But I think there is sometimes a misguided belief that we can, and I say this because of some of the things that have come out about the hindrances that staying within the EU or staying within the single market would put before a Labour government, which has been repeated quite a few times now, I think says to me that there are views which would seem to preclude them from wanting to stay in the EU. And I think there's a genuine kind of belief by some that actually we will be better off outside of the EU with an off-the-shelf deal, having our cake and eat it, and then we'll be able to have kind of changes to the free movement of labour and of people, and we'll also be able to do everything we want to do in terms of public ownership and all the other things we want to do. And I think that's a genuine belief of some people on the left that you can actually have both. Okay. And I think that's where it becomes difficult. And I know I said socialism in one country. That really is just really me putting it in a box and easy to understand. But it's basically they're not taking into account the fact that if the further we move from Europe, the more impact that will have on the economy and the implications that will have for spending and what we can do economically.
But is this? Oh, to do a follow. Is this?
We haven't got long.
Where can you find this argument to tackle it, to argue with it? It's so difficult because it's sort of nebulous. You know, it's not articulated.
I want to give you the last word by way of sort of rabble rousing. Hold on a minute. Say that again.
State aids. That's the argument. It's called state aid. In the EU, states are not supposed to subsidise companies.
Yeah, I understand the argument.
There's lots of counter arguments to that. You look at Germany, and
there's no shortage of nationalised railway systems in Europe. The last time I looked, I want to ask you a question, Caroline, which is just, in all honesty.
I thought I was going to ask the question.
I was going to, right.
What about the Labour Party?
No, all right, sorry. No.
I want to ask Caroline the question.
Oh, you're going to ask, go on. You ask Caroline the question.
Well,
you're not getting the last word. You're talking to her.
You've been in the European Parliament, a member of the European Parliament, and you've been a member of the House of Commons. And one of the things I find, which I don't want when I go into the Scottish part, you go into the House of Commons, it's like there's a sort of, you're in a parallel universe. Sort of, it chokes you. It's kind of the structures of sovereignty and what matters are completely different to what is happening outside of Westminster. It seems to me we are a modern country. This is not a country caught in decline and in this imperial system which Clive has described. But inside the palace of Westminster, it is like that. And so is that how you feel? And what is the European Parliament like in comparison? I mean,
it's funny, in my 10 years in the European Parliament, I never really thought that I would ever look back to that time and think about it with sort of rose-tinted glasses and think, those were the days. But I sort of do in many respects, because the building, I mean, it's open, it's light, you can move around it easily. It's built in a hemicycle so that you are more likely, I think architecture matters, I think you are more likely to talk to people of different views, and you recognise that the word compromise is not necessarily a dirty word. It can be a very noble seeking after sufficient common ground that allows you to move forward and so forth. And I do find the posturing of Westminster, as we are there in our serried ranks opposite one another, does breed a kind of a politics that's part of it. But the good news is, as we all know, that Westminster is falling into the river, quite literally. And so therefore, all of these discussions about going in and meeting in a different building, and, you know, I would love it to be up in the north in a glass building and so on and so forth, but actually almost wherever it is, it's got to be better than being in that museum.
Okay, Anthony, you have 30 seconds. By way of sending everybody home, not carrying sad emoji faces, tell me your sense of this moment and realistically the possibility of taking this whole conversation somewhere different, in all honesty.
Well, I think there's different things going on. I think there's an immense reluctance on the Remain side to sort of a prayer that somehow it can be stopped and we can revert back to normal. So I think that in the larger public, there's a deep reluctance, and certainly in the press and in the media, to keep it talking about who has said what to whom and who is going on where, and the fighting over it and what is happening in Brussels and this sort of thing, and not to talk about how we got here, why are we here, what does this mean, because that will involve saying this, we're looking at the end of Britain, we're looking at the end of a regime. But on the other hand, I think meetings like this, it's very evident people get together and start talking about their fears and their hopes and what is going on, it really takes off. And the question for me is, and the hope, and that's what I'm trying to do, is to get this argument into the proper media, into the political world which defines us. And we can win this argument, but we can only win this argument if we take it out to the public. And in part that depends on our breaking the hegemony, the closure of that old British system that wants to tell us to go to sleep and it'll be all right and they can run things.
Right, that only leaves me to say that that was probably the best post-Brexit meeting I've witnessed since the referendum, in terms of being uplifting and not downcast and miserable. And full of possibility. If you like what you've heard, I have read and reviewed Anthony's book. I've also lent my copy of it to someone else, which I shouldn't have done. I should have bought another copy and given it to them. It's available at the back. Anthony will sign it. I encourage anybody who's not read it to read the book. All it leaves for me to do really is to say thank you for coming and please thank our panel.